Welcome to From Grammar to Style. Almost everything you know about grammar is a lie.
Why is it all a lie, Carrie?
Well, because most of what we call grammar is not actually grammar.
What? So when somebody tells me my grammar sucks, what do they mean?
Usually they just mean you don't know the style rules that I have been taught.
Or it could mean you haven't spent enough time in this field or profession or discipline
Right.
to know how we do things here.
Right.
Okay, so it's not always your fault.
No, it's definitely not always your fault.
Okay, so what we are here to tell you today is some of the wonky details about why grammar and style are so different from one another, and why one we consider maybe a system of faulty rules, which we nevertheless abide by as best we can, and the other is actually a set of recommendations.
Yes.
Depending on the conventions or audience or field or discipline or whatever in which you work. So we're going to break it down for you, and we invite you to put your nerdy hat on and join us as we take you through these details.
So, yeah, what we really want to do is change the conversation about grammar. So, many people, when they think about writing, they really think about the word grammar. And they have all this anxiety around it, remembering how their high school English papers were marked up with red ink and how their teachers told them that, hey, your writing is not good.
Or, you could be the opposite of that. You could be one of those people who thinks of themselves as a particularly good grammar person, and who likes to police the grammar of others, and likes to keep that feather in your cap. And we're going to, make you feel a little bit bad that you don't actually know as much as you think you do. Or what you do know is not really what you think you know.
Right. But that might actually help you feel less self-conscious anyway, even if you do think that you're good at the grammar side, because you can focus too much on that, and we're going to help you figure out how to focus more on the content. And we're also here to debunk a lot of myths about writing, and many of the rules that you've been taught are actually totally made up, and all they do is help maintain the social hierarchy, because they're made up by old, dead white dudes.
Great. Because we need more of that in the world. Okay, so correct writing does not equal good writing. So lots of times when we talk about grammar, we're actually talking about things like spelling conventions, punctuation, style, sort of how you put something, things that are actually a little bit more subjective than what grammar actually is.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the rules about punctuation that we've been taught are I guess, quote unquote, correct, but they're not really helping you write better. That's just not what they're for. They're for the reader to interpret your sentence a little bit better, but don't get hung up on the punctuation. Don't get hung up on the spelling conventions. Really concentrate on your content, and the rest of it can come later.
Yeah, we want to emphasize that grammar, style, punctuation, spelling, all of those things are definitely important, and you will be judged for them in a writing context. However, they shouldn't hold you back at the beginning of a writing project when things like content, ideas, arguments, having a point, knowing your audience are going to be more important. So they're both equally important, content and style. However, they're important at different points in your writing process. I always used to tell my students, if you're turning in a first draft, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
You always want to make sure that you leave time for editing, for style, for editing, for punctuation, but don't let that prevent you from getting a first draft done.
Yeah. And we also want to emphasize the fact that true grammar really comes for free in your native language or languages.
What does that mean?
So when you're growing up, you're learning your language and you are learning the rules of your language and how to put it together. You can't really say something ungrammatical in your own native language or native dialect. You just can't, because it will hurt your brain. So things that are actually ungrammatical, make you you will react. You can actually see it. Here's something wonky. If you put someone in in an MRI machine or other kinds of machines, you can see your brain react to something that's ungrammatical.
Really?
Yeah.
Fascinating. So does that explain then why I might speak a different way at home with my family than I do in class?
Well, so that's a slightly different question.
Okay.
So the grammar is basically what you have. But you also have to learn different, what we call registers, or sometimes called different discourses. So you have different rules within each environment that you use your language.
Okay.
But that's slightly different level, shall we say.
Okay, that's for a different podcast or a different... Okay. So what are we here to do today? We really want to emphasize that bad grammar is just literally not going to make sense.
Right.
Okay, but bad style might make you cringe.
Mm-hmm.
It might make you kind of wrinkle your nose, but it's not necessarily incorrect.
Right.
It just might be what we call inelegant.
Inelegant, or sometimes just informal. And bad style, like style, you actually have to learn. Grammar, you just learn for free as you're growing up, but
Nobody teaches it to you.
Right, you don't have to be taught the actual grammar rules of your language. You have to be taught the style rules because there are things that
depend on context.
They depend on context, and they're also imposed on us.
Okay, so what do we mean by that? All right, so next slide. Are incorrect or simply inelegant? So bad style might be something like, I don't know, let's say in a job application letter, you would say, I have a lot of background experience that I can bring to this job. Nothing wrong with that sentence. It's perfectly grammatically sound. I wouldn't mark that as an English professor as being wrong. But it is bad style because essentially redundant. You don't have to say background experience. They mean sort of the same thing. You could delete one and it would still make sense. In American standard English, we don't like to be redundant. We were raised on Strunk and White. We don't use extra words. The Brits, they do that all the time. But but Americans, we don't like to use too many words if we don't have to. So you could just write experience or background. In that case, it's not incorrect. It's just informal or inelegant. But is it ungrammatical?
No, absolutely not. So things that can be ungrammatical, and this also depends on the dialect of English. So we're talking about standard North American English here. I done it before, or I brang what I know, they are ungrammatical. There are dialects where they're okay, but for standard English, which most business English is in, those would be bad.
Okay.
So bad style, what counts as bad style is very dependent on a bunch of different factors. So we're just going to say, yeah, of course you can use what's considered to be bad style, but you will be judged by certain people. Whereas bad grammar, it's harder to make those mistakes unless you're not a native speaker of English. And technically they're okay to use, but people will judge you more and you might not be understood. So the examples we give, you will be understood, but there are examples where you will not.
Okay.
So there really is a difference between bad style and bad grammar.
So remember, if somebody's telling you your grammar is bad, probably what they mean is your style could be adjusted.
Right.
Okay.
Or it might even just be typos. So, True. For example, your versus your, there are two ways of spelling it, and they come with different grammatical uses. Mm-hmm. You're not being ungrammatical, you're just not writing it correctly.
Yeah. And that's perfectly fine too.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to do it in business English, but if you make it
not in a final draft. You can do it in an early draft.
Yes, right, absolutely. So first drafts, who cares? But yeah, later you will need to fix it. But for example, if you're tweeting it, no one should care.
Yeah. Unless you're the president, but even then nobody cares.
Well, that's a whole different issue. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, so grammar, it's not a lie exactly. It's just that what we call grammar is a lie. So grammar exists, but really what grammar is to a linguist anyway is the set of rules that you have for your entire language. So it's not just about sentence structure, but other things as well. But it comes for free. When you're learning your native language or languages, you are learning your grammar. We all have different versions of the grammar, so each individual person has their own grammar.
Wow.
But yeah, I know. Because we have different brains. But a lot of them converge, so they look very similar. And then you also have different sort of what we call registers with different areas of your life.
Yeah, so the way I speak to my doctor is going to be different from how I speak to my students, which is going to be different than how I speak to my kids' teacher.
Or with writing as well, right? Like, so the way I write for, say, this is different than how I write, say, my former academic life, my academic writing. It's very different from this.
Yeah, or how you might write a letter for a job application for one job is going to be different than you might write a letter for a different job, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even though the jobs may be identical in every way, let's say you might know somebody on the other end of one letter and you don't know the person on the other end of the letter. So the way you use those registers or those discourses are going to be context dependent.
Right. And a lot of the grammar rules, which mostly are style rules, were actually created as a way of separating basically the educated elites from the hoi polloi. So when you have a lot of schooling, generally speaking, you learn a lot more of these rules and you have a lot more time to practice these rules. So if you have less schooling or you went to a school that is less elite, you might not have learned these rules. And so people feel okay judging them for not having the correct rules. But if you think about it, what you're judging them for is not having the correct education.
And historically, this is true with every literacy crisis that ever struck the English language going back to Plato.
Yes.
Anytime the masses entered domains of learning and education, for example, when the people were brought in from the farms and taught to read, the Industrial Revolution, there was a literacy crisis because then it became, what are we going to do with all of these uneducated masses who can't read the instructions on how to use the machines? What are we going to do with all of these brown people and speakers of other languages who are suddenly being allowed into institutions of higher learning? They can't write. What are we going to do with all of these kids today who spend all of their time on iPads and video games? They can't read. Literacy crises are as old as time immemorial, and they often have to do with elites emphasizing their made-up rules as a way to keep the masses out.
Right. And basically every complaint that you can think of has already happened. So people complain about language. Oh, language is being ruined by millennials. Go back to, again, Plato. Go back to, Jonathan Swift. Everyone's complained. They've always complained about it. Or, oh, the youth these days are doing X.
Yes.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. History has shown us that these things come in waves.
Yeah.
So. And they're usually around technologies.
Yeah. And writing is one of the earliest technologies. So we're going to teach you some of the rules and how they're made up, but also what's important is to know when can they be broken. So, we talked about some things that were inelegant and rather than being incorrect. And if it's inelegant, depends on your audience whether you need to fix it or not. So background information might be totally fine in a job letter because certain businesses, that's the regular jargon. But for some, they might judge you for it. And so you should really consider who you're talking to.
Yeah, if you're applying for a journalism job, they're going to be a lot more stringent about their expectations for your writing than, say, an engineering job.
Absolutely, yeah. So really, remember, style is subjective. Grammar is much less subjective. You really have, the rules are harder to break. So how do you know when you can bend the rules? Again, context, audience, really depends. And also, genre matters as well. So now let's look at some rules, how they came to be, and why they are questionable.
So this is the wonky part. Style rule number 1. You've probably heard this before. Don't end sentences in prepositions.
Yes. So this is completely made up by a poet. It is, by a poet named John Dryden in 1672. And so here's the rule. If you say, who did you talk to, that's supposed to be bad. What you're supposed to say is, to whom did you talk? But to whom did you talk sounds very formal, overly formal in most instances. And he made it up for two reasons. One, to make English more like Latin, because they considered, people in that era, white men in that era considered Latin to be the best language ever.
Because they had the luxury of spending a lot of time learning Latin.
Sure, but even still, it was still like...
It's a way to hold yourself up as being more educated than someone else.
Right, but they could have chosen Greek. Mm-hmm. They could have chosen Hebrew.
True.
They chose
Latin. Okay.
And the other reason was because he wanted to dunk on a different writer, Ben Jonson, who had already been dead for 35 years when he made up this rule. And this is the funniest part of the story to me. John Dryden had written a bunch of poems where there sentences that ended in prepositions, so he went back and retconned them.
Oh my god!
And fixed them so that the prepositions went with the noun, like to whom.
And republished?
That I don't know.
Oh, okay. Weird.
Yeah.
That's such a crazy, weird story.
It's silly. So if you want to follow this rule because you just don't want to be called out on it, that's fine. But if you're enforcing this rule, think about how how unfortunate that is, because it was made up by someone who just had hate on for another writer. And also, I would say stylistically, ending a sentence in a preposition is often better. Who did you talk to is stylistically better than to whom did you talk.
Wow. It's like 17th century East Coast versus West Coast rap.
Yes.
Except with white dudes.
Except with white dudes, and he'd already been killed. He'd already died.
Yeah. Disrespect the dead.
Yeah, that's another thing. If you're all about respecting the dead, then definitely don't uphold that rule.
Yeah. Style rule number 2: don't split infinitives.
So an infinitive is something like to go. So for example, the famous example from Star Trek, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Strictly speaking, this is splitting the infinitive because you have a word in between to and go. You have boldly in there. But it sounds totally fine. What sounds weird is to follow this rule, to say to go boldly where no one's gone before. Little weird. Boldly to go where no one has gone before. Really weird. So stylistically, really, the wrong one, quote unquote wrong one, is best. It was probably made up by John Comely in 1803. It's the first example that we can find of someone writing about it.
And again, it makes English sound more like Latin.
Right. It's all about Latin.
This infatuation with Latin.
It's very strange.
We all love the Italians, but come on.
Yeah, I mean, the Romans were fine. Ish. Some things they were really good about.
Don't quote you on that, right?
Some things they were really bad about. But anyway, so Latin infinitives are just one word. So if you know French or Spanish, you know like the infinitive form is one word as well. But again, there's no reason not to split an infinitive. If you have two words, the definition is that you can stick another word in between them. So it makes total sense that we can do this, and we've been able to do it for a long time. And then in 1800 something, someone was like, no, let's make it more like English. And again, it reinforces the idea that elites who already knew Latin are superior because they know this rule that is completely manufactured. And in fact, there are some instances where it's ungrammatical to not split it. So we expect...
You just split it.
Right.
Well done.
Right.
Let's see what you did there.
You kind of have to there too, actually. You have to... Anyway. So we expect it to more than double is the only way you can say it. You can't... So more than splits the infinitive to and double. If you say we expect it more than to double, it sounds pretty bad. And we expect it to double more than is actually 100% ungrammatical.
So that's the difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, I would say you can and should split infinitives because stylistically it's often better. Unfortunately, some people will judge you for it, so just be aware.
Okay.
But you have an argument now
Yeah.
that they're wrong.
So take that, grammar Nazis.
Why do you want to call yourself that?
I don't know why. Why is that an attractive label?
Even it was bad before, but now...
No, not so much. Okay, so style rule number 3. Double negatives are bad. So tell us why double negatives are not actually that bad.
So there are 2 kinds, but this kind is the one that George Orwell spoke about or wrote about. So if you say something like she is not unkind, you have 2 negatives there, the not and the un. And he argued that this is bad because you could just say she is kind. However, she is not unkind has a slightly different meaning than she is kind. So she is kind is just a straightforward statement. She is not unkind. You're saying, she's a little bit kind. She could be kinder, right? So there is a meaning there when you use these double negatives. So it's fine to use them as long as you know why you're doing it. So you will be judged for this, but sometimes it's actually stylistically better, or you're putting across a more nuanced meaning. Another instance would be, I can't not go. And that would be, you'd be more likely to use that in speech because it doesn't really come across as well in writing. But you can still use it as long as you know why you're using it.
Okay.
The second kind of double negative, this is actually grammar. So
this is the kind of stuff that makes you cringe.
Yes. Okay. So many, well, if you're a standard English speaker, I think from all regions, I don't know nothing will sound bad to you. However, there are many dialects of English that use these, and they are fine in those dialects. It's just not okay in standard English. So you have to say, I don't know anything instead. And this really is a real grammatical difference, but it's also made up.
Another one.
Again, old white dude, this time a bishop in 1762. And again, it was about making English more like Latin. Once again, this obsession with Latin. So Latin didn't have double negatives, mostly. But weirdly, I think all, or maybe just most of its descendant languages do. So like French, you have ne and rien. Those are both negative things, not and nothing. So I don't regret nothing. It's literally what it says. But I regret nothing, or I don't regret anything, is how it would be said in standard English.
I see.
And earlier versions of English used to have it standardly. So Chaucer violated basically all of these rules.
Which is why we love him.
Yes, plus the naughty bits.
Yes.
So there was no man anywhere so virtuous. That's the modern day version of their not no man nowhere so virtuous. So you have 3 negatives there.
Daring.
And yeah, so
this was an old white dude we actually like.
Yes, well, I'm sure there were problems with Chaucer too, but
yes.
But one of the things he said was something like, he also talks about how people complain about language changing, but language just changes. I wish I had the quote right on the tip of my tongue, but I don't. But he was like an original linguist.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, even though this rule was made up, you were going to have to follow it.
Okay.
Because people will definitely judge you in business English for this.
Yes. Hypercorrections. These are my favorite because they happen so frequently, and you might not know the term for it, but now you do. The word is hypercorrection, and this is when you correct yourself to the point of being actually incorrect.
Right.
Explain that.
So here, an example would be, so me and Sally went to the store. Technically by like the standard rules of English, this would be wrong because you have the object form me there in the subject position. And so what you should say is Sally and I went to the store. There's also a style thing here because everyone tells you to switch the order. They don't want you to put the first person first. You want to put the third person first because it makes you seem really egocentric or something. But that's another issue. When you correct all of the me's to I, then you start making mistakes. So just between you and me is correct by the regular rules. And just between you and I is a hypercorrection because you are correcting to the subject version, even though this is not a subject. This is an object of the preposition to be.
I've always been told that the rule is basically if you could replace me with I Or if you could replace yourself, how does it go?
So one way to do this would be to...
Now I'm confusing myself.
It's confusing. So one way to test this is combine you and I into us.
Okay.
It's not we. That would be the subject form. Just between we sounds terrible, right? But just between us is perfect. So the object form goes there.
Okay.
And then the second hypercorrection, I kind of hate both of these, but this one I might hate slightly more because I kind of want whom to die. So because the rules for whom are actually kind of complicated, I'm going to simplify it here. Because they're complicated, people mess it up. So who called Sally? That's the subject version. Totally fine. No one would... that's the normal way most people would say it. Whom did Sally call? That's the object form. Fewer people would use that. And I would only do it if I had to. But that's technically the quote-unquote correct form.
In writing, what would we do, though?
It really depends, right? How formal is this writing? Technically, it should be whom. Whom did Sally call? Rather than who did Sally call. But I want it to die, so... So who
So it depends on your audience's expectations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if somebody tells you to change it to whom, change it to whom.
Right. But otherwise, just stick with who.
Okay.
But here's a case where it is a mistake, and people do these things. So whom called Sally is incorrect because that's the subject and you're using the object form. But you will hear it, usually in slightly more complicated contexts, but it's still incorrect. So I would say stick with who, especially if you don't know the rule. And if someone wants to correct it, then yeah, fine, let them correct it.
Especially if they're probably somebody more senior in your field.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. But I want it to die.
So in summary, grammar and style are two very, very different things. They're related in a lot of ways. They come up together in the same contexts. But grammar is one of those things where it's so innate in your use of language that you'll know when it's wrong. And it'll make your brain misfire if it's wrong. Most of the time when people want to correct grammar, truthfully, what they're correcting is style.
Right, and usually the style rules that they're correcting are completely made up and are a way of enforcing this social hierarchy where white men are at the top.
So that's why Carrie and I cringe whenever we see people being proud of themselves for correcting other people's grammar. Because unless you're one of those folks who is a narcissist, or you're so incredibly educated on the specifics of grammaticality, then there's really no reason to correct other people's grammar.
I would say unless someone has asked you or you're their teacher, you should not correct anybody's typos, grammar, style.
Yeah. Or unless, the context is so glaringly egregious.
Yeah, like if someone's using the wrong word, I can sometimes see the like, hey, I think you mean this, because otherwise the meaning can get lost.
Yeah.
So there probably are times when it's okay to correct someone, but I would just say less is more.
Okay.
Unless, or you're their boss or something. Like there's got to be some reason why your opinion really matters.
Yeah. And otherwise, it's one of those things where, like in art, for example, the more you know the rules and the better you know the rules, the more you know that the rules are arbitrary.
Right. Yes.
And so then it becomes one of those things where knowing when and how to break the rules is a real show of expertise.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So the more comfortable you get with writing, the easier it is to break these rules. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Now, there are some industries or professions where it's really hard to break these rules because you will be really judged.
Yeah, I'm legal writing, medical, technical writing, those kinds of things.
Right. So, of course, consider your audience, consider the conventions in your field, but just know that it's a style thing for the most part. Very rarely is it actually grammatical.
Yeah. So we hope you feel better about yourself as a writer. We hope that you're better educated on these rules and systems, and we hope that you'll come to us for help and advice in the future should you need it.
Yes.